This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Randall Kennedy. Randall Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He has an education which began at, according to this, probably earlier, but St. Albans School in Washington, D.C., and then he went to Princeton and Oxford and Yale Law School. He was a clerk for Judge Skelly Wright and also for Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. And he's had a prize, the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and Law. His most recent books are For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law. That's in 2013. And The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics and the Obama Presidency, 2011. And let's do the list. And previous before that, Sell Out: The Politics of Racial Betrayal, Interracial Intimacies, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption. And Nigger, this is your book. Nigger: The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word. The Persistence of the Color Line, and the one that I mentioned earlier, which is mentioned here twice, and those are all your distinctions, yes. And there are many others too I could mention. He's a trustee of Princeton University, so he takes responsibility for much of what goes on at Princeton. And anyway, before this a small but distinguished crowd, I introduce Randall Kennedy, and he's going to talk on the racial promised land in the USA.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate your hosting me,
Right.
and I look forward to a discussion. So this paper is provisionally titled "A Racial Promised Land?" ? On April 3rd, 1968, the night before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. announced that he had been to the mountaintop and glimpsed the racial promised land. He did not, however, describe it. He did not specify its borders, topography, or landmarks. He and other leaders of the black revolts of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s did offer hints regarding what they hoped a racial promised land would offer. One can find clues in such books as What the Negro Wants, an anthology of essays by black thinkers and institutional leaders published in 1944, or Walter White's How Far the Promised Land, published in 1955, or Stokely Carmichael's What We Want and the Platform of the Black Panther Party, both of which were published in 1966. The most famous and consequential of these efforts to adumbrate a racial promised land was King's I Have a Dream address delivered at the 1963 March on Washington. There he spoke with longing of a nation in which individuals would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. One of the reasons that that formulation is so popular is that it is amenable to contending interpretations and thus useful as a banner for competing forces. Was King condemning all racial classifications, an interpretation favored by opponents of affirmative action? Or was he only condemning invidious racial classifications, an interpretation favored by defenders of affirmative action? Like other polemics, Jeremiads, and manifestos of that period, the I Have a Dream address both nourished and reflected the Second Reconstruction's struggles for racial change. But neither King's great speech nor any kindred offerings provide a reliable map of a racial promised land. In Racism, Sexism, and Preferential Treatment, an approach to the topics, Professor Richard Wasserstrom broached the question, what would the good or just society make of race? And to what degree, if at all, would racial distinctions ever be taken into account? Writing in 1976, he complained about the state of thinking regarding this matter, maintaining that too little focus had been directed toward clarifying the racial ends to which Americans ought to aspire. Diffidence in theorizing about the ultimate racial good has persisted. This probably stems to some extent from the strong tendency in American constitutional and statutory discourse, at least with respect to race relations, to stipulate what law should seek to prohibit as opposed to what law should seek to create. The 13th Amendment and its case law progeny prohibits slavery. It does not designate the essentials of freedom. The 14th Amendment and its case law progeny prohibits states from denying persons the equal protection of the law. It does not elaborate on what equality means in terms of a positive entitlement. The 15th Amendment and its case law progeny prohibits states from denying persons the vote on a racial basis. It does not arm citizens with a right to vote. The major rubrics we use for understanding and applying race relations law are couched in negative terms: anti-discrimination, anti-classification, anti-subordination. We write extensively about what we repudiate: slavery, Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow. We write much less about what we desire. Commentators, politicians, and jurists of various stripes declaim earnestly that they yearn for racial equality, racial fairness, racial justice. But what precisely do they mean when they allude to these abstractions? Answers that have been forthcoming, while useful in certain ways, are problematic in others. One conception of the racial promised land that has been widely voiced is the ideal of a race-blind society. Such a society, Professor William Van Alstyne avers, would be animated by a complete, resolute, and credible commitment never to tolerate the differential treatment of human beings by race. That, according to Van Alstyne, is the great lesson for government itself to teach. In all we do in life, whatever we do in life, to treat any person less well than another, or to favor any more than another for being black or white or brown or red, is wrong. There are weighty objections to a social ideal that would unequivocally and comprehensively render intolerable the differential treatment of other human beings by race. One is that extinguishing and keeping extinguished race-dependent decision-making in all areas of life would entail a level of intrusiveness upon freedom of association that many people would rightly find unacceptable. It would involve, for example, the policing of choices regarding dating, marriage, and adoption. Such choices are highly consequential. They affect the allocation of property and the distribution of valuable knowledge regarding business, employment, and other endeavors facilitated by social networks. Still, as Professor Glenn Lowry writes, there's a sphere of intimate social intercourse governed to some degree by race perceptions in individuals' minds that, out of respect for liberty and the dignity of human beings, should not become the object of political or bureaucratic manipulation. That is why many would find it utterly unacceptable to try to prohibit, punish, or even discourage race-dependent decision-making in the precincts of intimate association. Some with this view believe racially discriminatory dating, marriage, or adoption to be silly, self-defeating, or even immoral. But they object even more to any policing mechanism encroaching upon this delicate sphere. Relatedly, there are many people for whom racial identity is a major feature of their personal identity. They think of themselves and like thinking of themselves as white, black, Latino, Native American, or more probably a more particular tribal nation affiliation, and so forth. They affiliate themselves with organizations that are expressly racialist. Some are organizations that many observers might be willing to bar from a racial promised land without much regret. The National Association for the Advancement of White People, the White Aryan Resistance, the White Patriot Party. But what about the Harvard Black Law Students Association, or the National Association of Black Journalists, or the Congressional Black Caucus, or the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, or the Society of Hispanic Engineers, or the National Association of Asian American Professionals, or the Asian American Writers Workshop, or the American Indian Business Leaders Association, or the National Native American Bar Association, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is true that in many instances, people of color established organizations of their own when they were excluded from or made to feel unwelcome by organizations dominated by whites. But organizations established as a reaction to racist exclusion have taken on institutional lives of their own. They have become, for many, far more than temporary refuges, readily dispensable upon the emergence of wider opportunities. They have become beloved institutions that many devotees would be unwilling to leave behind at the border of a racial promised land. They have become institutions that many people will continue to want to sustain and enjoy after the revolution. Here it is well to recall Alexander Picalis's Full Equality in a Free Society, a program for Jewish action. Writing on behalf of the American Jewish Congress, Picalis asserted that freedom is even more important than equality, and that no society is free unless it assures the freedom of individual and collective self-expression. The American Jewish Congress, he announced approvingly, would reject individual equality if its price were renunciation of our collective individuality. Many blacks and people with other affiliations adopt this position. They abjure the equality offered by any process of assimilation that requires the abandonment of their racial identity. They refuse to allow their racial loyalty to be incinerated in the American melting pot. They embrace Justice John Marshall Harlan's oft overlooked declaration that every true man has pride of race. There is another conception of race blindness that is more modest. It does not demand a society that is race blind, but only a federal constitution that is race blind. The idea of the race blind constitution has attracted near consensus support among the justices of the federal Supreme Court. They sharply divide, however, over tactics. One camp contends that the best way to perfect race-blind constitutionalism is immediately to prohibit the government from taking race into account in decision-making. This camp condemns not only invidious racial discrimination, segregation, but also positive racial discrimination, affirmative action. Another camp contends that the best way to perfect race-blind constitutionalism is to prohibit invidious racial discrimination immediately, but to permit positive racial discrimination temporarily. While this conflict is certainly important, nothing has been more contentious in race relations law over the past 40 years. It is essential to recognize that both of these camps say that they seek to reach a state of affairs in which race finally plays no appreciable role in governmental decision-making. There are important objections to race-blind constitutionalism as an ideal. I will note two. The first is directed to the immediatist camp of race-blind constitutionalists, those who contend that we will have reached the racial promised land when governments in America are prohibited from taking race into account in decision-making. To race-blind constitutional immediatists, the existence of large gaps between the power, wealth, status, and opportunities of whites as opposed to people of color does not by itself preclude the attainment of the racial promised land, so long as government no longer makes racial distinctions. They maintain that race-blind constitutionalism need not be contingent upon the attainment of racial parity. For the immediatists, in other words, removing the scars of past racial wrongs is not a prerequisite for the racial promised land. For them, the racial promised land can coexist with social conditions under which, across a range of domains, people of color consistently, even uniformly, fare poorly in comparison with whites, so long as those outcomes are not attributable to some contemporary, direct, purposeful racial discrimination undertaken by governmental authority. A sign of the profound moral numbness of some immediatists is their perception that affirmative action and kindred policies of positive racial discrimination are the main impediment standing in the way to a final resolution of the American race question. For them, the main impediment is not the stubborn, looming fact that with respect to practically every index of well-being, length of life, health, wealth, employment, education, housing, whites on average fare better, lots better than blacks and certain other people of color. Their willingness to declare victory despite the embarrassing presence of those facts is one of the things that makes their conception of the racial promised land unacceptable. These stark racial disparities delineate pigmentocracy in the United States, a state of affairs in which those who are dark are at far greater risk than those who are white of suffering from a long litany of social catastrophes: unemployment, poverty, incarceration, eviction. This greater risk is not accidental. It is the upshot of racial injustice, by which I mean, following Amy Gutman, an injustice whose source includes either present or past indefensible discrimination based on race. Unworthy of support is any vision of the racial promised land that accepts such a large presence of racial injustice. A big problem also confronts race-blind constitutionalists who want eventually to do away with all government race-dependent decision-making. This is the camp that is willing to accept affirmative action and kindred policies as transitional devices that must be retired at some point when the unjust conditions from which they arose have been suitably ameliorated. The ground has shifted beneath the feet of this camp. While initially conceived as a transitory device to redress the debilitating scars of past racial wrongs in order to effectuate compensatory justice, the ascendant conception of positive discrimination is now very different. Affirmative action is primarily justified currently on grounds of diversity or creating institutions that look like America. The diversity rationale is the belief that ensuring the racial heterogeneity of student bodies, faculties, and organizations of all sorts will be good for these entities by creating a multiracial, cross-pollinating synthesis of perspectives and experiences that will produce more knowledge and insight and generate better decision-making. The looks like America rationale is the belief that ensuring racial heterogeneity is essential for legitimation and distributive justice. Affirmative action grounded on these rationales is not transitory but permanent. As long as America is composed of discrete racial groups, the aim to capture the benefits of diversity will always prompt the insurance of racial heterogeneity. Similarly, as long as America is composed of discrete racial groups, the aim to sustain legitimacy and distribute racial goodies fairly will always prompt gatekeepers to be race observant as opposed to race blind. Proponents of race-blind constitutionalism who support temporary positive racial discrimination thus find themselves in an awkward position. The affirmative action they support has turned into a practice that is at odds with even the delayed version of their race-blind aspiration. An alternative to a race-blind future envisions the presence of certain sorts of racial distinctions even after having achieved the racial promised land. Proponents try to vivify this ideal through the invocation of various metaphors. America as a multiracial salad, a multiracial mosaic, a multiracial orchestra. A formulation that posits essentially the same message as these metaphors received a big boost in 1992 when candidate and then President Bill Clinton promised to select a cabinet that looks like America. Currently, it is commonplace for people to assert that police departments, faculties, and the ranks of Academy Award nominees, corporate CEOs, doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc., ought to mirror racially the communities in which they are situated. Behind such assertions is the belief that ideally every important social domain, from the high, the United States Senate, to the low, the prison population, should mirror the racial demographics of the country so that all of these spheres look like America. One reason that some observers prefer the looks like America model to the race-blind model is that the former, with its latent proportionalism, guarantees a colored presence in forums that have long been monopolized or overwhelmingly dominated by whites. Race blindness fully matured is indifferent to the racial demographics generated by any given raceless process of selection or allocation. Looks like America, by contrast, demands the inclusion of people of color and thus assuages lingering distrust regarding the administration of facially raceless rules and standards. Another attraction for some of the diversity, racial mosaic, or looks like America motifs is that all of them present racial difference in general and racial coloredness in particular as virtues to be lauded and utilized, as opposed to problems to be minimized or merely tolerated. The model of a racial promised land that embraces positive racial recognition and makes it permanent enables coloredness to be seen as a valuable credential. The looks like America ideal and its kindred formulations, however, also confront important objections. One is the small group problem. The looks like America model guarantees the presence of certain minority groups if they are sufficiently large. But if numbers alone are key, minority groups that are relatively small can be eclipsed in the struggle for group recognition. A racial minority group constituting 20% of the American population might well argue that under a norm of rough proportionalism, it is entitled to at least one seat in a presidential cabinet of 12. But what about a racial minority group constituting only 2 or 3% of the American population? That group cannot plausibly claim that on the basis of demography, it is entitled to a seat in any particular cabinet. Furthermore, there's the difficulty of determining the identities of which groups count. In assessing whether a cabinet looks like America, should we ask whether it contains a Chinese American, Japanese American, or Thai American? Or should we ask whether it contains anyone who has any aspect of a Pan-Asian identity? And then there's the difficulty of determining whether a given person is a suitable representative of a group. In the racial promised land, will the son of, say, a white mother and a black father be a suitable representative for blacks? Or should he be designated as the representative for whites or multiracials? These questions are not unanswerable. We are already responding to them with varying results. But for some observers, any envisioned future polity that requires the posing of such questions should be disqualified as a racial promised land. A related objection is that the looks like America model normalizes practices that inevitably subordinate claims of individual merit to claims of racial group fairness. Why, skeptics ask, should demography be destiny, at least with respect to determining the opportunities and assessments that govern the life course of individuals in the racial promised land? The flip side of disparities in which there are said to be too few racial minorities are disparities in which there are said to be too many, as in too many people of Asian descent at Harvard, or too many people of African descent in the National Basketball Association. In a society governed by an imperative for racial representativeness, some black players in the NBA might be benched in order to create teams that more fully look like America. To conclude, I return to Martin Luther King Jr., particularly the challenge posed by the title of his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? In light of the significant problems that shadow contending concepts of the racial promised land, I suggest that we do two things that are in tension with one another. First, we should continue to think about alternative conceptions of the good racial order under which we would like to live. New information and fresh insight could produce novel formulations that offer guidance to beneficent sentiments that might otherwise dissipate for lack of direction. Second, we should reconsider whether it is worthwhile to try to reconceptualize or to try to conceptualize an ideal settlement, a final solution to the American racial conundrum. We should reconsider whether the search for a detailed, thoroughly worked out blueprint for a racial promised land is mistaken. This pursuit is, after all, an iteration of utopianism, an intellectual endeavor with a checkered history. Armed with a willingness and ability to impose their conceptions of the good, utopians of various stripes have given large-scale social planning a bad odor, one that often reeks of coercion, hubris, and delusion. Against the specter of utopian miscalculation, it is worthwhile reassessing the state of our racial policy. It is a hodgepodge filled with lacunae intentions. Our lawmakers have expressly declared in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that in the workplace there should be no bona fide occupational qualification exception to anti-discrimination standards for race, though there is for gender. Yet, as a matter of fact, employers openly and with little fear of legal liability declare that for certain positions they are searching only for people of certain races. As when the film director George Lucas openly advertised for black actors for roles in his film Red Tails about the black Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. Jurists, C.E.G. Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, who claim to be immediatist believers in race-blind constitutionalism, concede that they would permit governmental racial selectivity for purposes of addressing an emergency. Jurists who claim to believe in delayed race-blind constitutionalism, C.E.G. Sandra Day O'Connor or, let's say, Stephen Breyer, support race-dependent decision-making based on rationales with no real temporal endpoints. Still, rather than viewing our conflicted amalgam of beliefs as an embarrassing liability in need of wholesale correction, maybe it is better to view them more appreciatively, as a guide appropriate to the complexity, variety, and volatility of the racial situation in America. I began by insinuating that the absence of a worked-out model of the racial promised land was a deficiency that reflects poorly upon us. But maybe our paucity of utopian musing reflects commendable pragmatism. Maybe it is prudent to forswear the designing of a grand blueprint that would seek to master America's unruly racial reality. Perhaps the best that can safely be managed are smaller interstitial provisional goals that are attentive to the pluralism that infuse American practices. Distaste for racial prejudice alongside demands for privacy that permit racial prejudice. Aversion to unjustifiable racial distinctions alongside accommodated desires to identify in racial terms. An imperative to remedy racial injustice alongside an insistence upon attending to the other manifold problems that confront our present and future. Thank you.
Paul Peterson.
Well, thank you. That was very eloquent and insightful. I do have a couple of comments. One is you didn't make the distinction between private and state action, which was part of jurisprudence in the 19th century and continues down to the present. Because it does illuminate the point that we rightfully make, that we, in our private lives, should be allowed to discriminate in any way we wish. But that does not provide any justification for state discrimination. So some of the examples you gave early on, I don't see pertinent to the final argument as to what should the state be doing, should the state be discriminating. So when you quote Harlan, he does obviously recognize that individuals should be able to make choices on their own, but he does say the Constitution is colorblind. So maybe you could comment on that. I will say this, so a good example of that is a decision that has been made recently where a person who is a descendant of a tribe, 184th descendant or something like that.
64th.
What is it?
It was 164th.
64th, okay, I'm in there. It was taken away from her family to be placed. And that does strike one as somehow a kind of state action, affirmative action, that one finds very difficult to justify. The second point would be perhaps one of the principles that you might consider is what is good for the poorest of the African American community. And when you think about affirmative action in that context, you wonder whether or not the persistence of a poor African American community is not necessary to justify the privileges given to elite members of the African American community. Because so long as there is great problems in the African American community, low income, poor education, inadequate housing, no food, the case for affirmative action is very powerful. But of course the case for affirmative action, it always seems to be a case for elites to have access to Harvard or to the White House or to the cabinet or whatever. So to what extent is affirmative action, is it necessary to perpetuate the poverty and incapacity of large numbers of African Americans to justify the perquisites of a few? Just a couple comments.
Okay. On your first one, I actually thought that I did. I wanted to make very clear that there's a distinction between the private realm and the public realm, because I think oftentimes people forget that. I mean, people sort of toss around race blindness willy-nilly and actually forget about the very important, very consequential decisions that people make in the most intimate spheres of their lives. And, people don't think about that as a part of life that, you could regulate if you were so minded. I mean, but, our society, and I think rightly so, has made the decision not to regulate that. But I mean, I thought that I wasn't conflating the two, that I really did want to take seriously the distinction between the private and the public. Professor Van Alstyne's often that quoted with a very stentorian, we can't ever tolerate racial distinctions. But then you ask, well, dating, marriage, really? Drop a little footnote here. There was a time, by the way, though, when I say, could it be regulated? In the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the very first draft of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the Congress of the United States initially proposed criminalizing racial discrimination in spheres that we would now view as very private. So, for instance, they expressly said churches cannot engage in racial discrimination. Now, that was taken out. It did not become part of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. But initially it was in. It was in enough for there to be a debate about it. There are there are people in the law reviews, there are jurists in the law reviews who have asked the question, well, what about a thought experiment in which we would attempt in various ways, maybe indirect ways, to attack racial discrimination in the private sphere? But I hear you. I do think that people need to be aware of the two spheres, and I thought I was trying to do that. With respect to your affirmative action point, and I'm a defender of affirmative action. A last book, For Discrimination. That's right. I mean, the title was taken with For Discrimination, and I'm willing to defend it. I think that your point is a well-taken point, that as it's turned out, affirmative action for the most part is a social policy that largely benefits, people like me. I mean, it benefits the people who are higher up. I mean, after all, you're pretty privileged if you were even a plausible candidate to be considered for, let's say, the University of Michigan Law School. I mean, if you're being considered for the University of Michigan Law School, you're doing pretty good. You've graduated from high school, you've graduated from college. I mean, you're pretty high up there. So there are people, certainly on the left there are people, and there are people on the right who have raised this criticism of affirmative action, and I think it's a good criticism. My line is, it's not a reason to do away with affirmative action. I would say maybe we should, rejigger affirmative action, maybe enlarge affirmative action, do something to try to help out those who are further down. But I hear your point, and I agree with your point. I think, basically affirmative action is, in most instances, a rather elitist form of redistribution. But my bottom line is, I'll take what I can get.
Well, if I can follow up, I'm sorry to take up so much time. Responses are good ones. But what if actually it perpetuates poverty in the African community? Maybe, because if there's affirmative action out there and you're an employer and once you hire this African American man, you can't get rid of them without possibility there's a problem. Why hire them in the first place? That's just an example of, I could spell that out.
Listen, like I said, I'm a defender of affirmative action, have been, but to me, it's sort of, a guess. I'm for it because I'm making certain guesses about the way things work. If you sat down with me and said, Kennedy, listen, actually, you're wrong. If we did away with this, and this would happen, and it would conduce to the benefit of the people that you're talking about. I mean, if you convinced me of that, or let me put it like this, I could be convinced of that. If you persuaded me of that, I would say bye-bye to affirmative action. And in fact, I would be willing to say bye-bye to affirmative action with respect to a variety of alternative policies. So, I mean, if somebody came to me and said, listen, Kennedy, I tell you what, trade in all of the affirmative action programs across the United States, and in return, I will give you excellent, and I mean excellent, K through 12 education. Deal? I take absolutely, bing, right? Let's shake right now. But of course, there is no such deal on the table.
Yes.
All right, so I wanted to, as an Asian, give a little bit of a perspective and ask for your commentary on more on the sciences end. And two things that, I'm in physics, come up immediately. One is that the groups, going back to group identity, get severely exacerbated when the field is dominated by foreigners, right? So we hear all this stuff of meaning more certain hyphenated American groups in the STEM fields, but say half of our postdocs and grad students come from overseas, and larger part China, who of course have no sort of dog in this fight. So the policies end up being, I think, very strange that you're trying to promote a very small group of people when the majority of the people that are actually doing the work didn't even come from America. And then secondarily, this sort of goes back to this recent Supreme Court decision where it was either Roberts or Alito said that he didn't know why it mattered if you were a certain hyphenated group in physics. And I think that's, it almost seems like a religious belief among the minority of American practitioners of affirmative action that somehow diverse groups lead to better research outcomes. But we're all supposed to be driven by the data, and I have seen not a single study or piece of data anywhere whatsoever on technical projects that show that a variety of cultural perspectives lead to any benefit whatsoever, let alone demonstrable, statistically significant outcomes. So we're sort of ending up with this group of sort of minorities that are almost committed to this as a religious belief. Nobody else can discuss it without being called racist. But I mean, really, the data doesn't exist, and it's completely backwards. So I don't know, some comments on that.
I'm gonna respond, but I want to go back to the promised land. I mean, affirmative action is such a powerful thing. Obviously, I think it's sort of it has a magnetic quality. The questions go to. I mention it, but it's not really central to my main thing.
Yeah, but even the promised land is not there's no demonstration that that's any better for anything that we're trying to do as researchers, for instance.
Well, on your point about the I agree with you. But I would say the villain, as far as I'm concerned, in the story is the Supreme Court of the United States. Because the Supreme Court of the United States has made it so that people like me, who are in favor of affirmative action, the Supreme Court of the United States has basically said, with respect to higher education anyway, the only justification for affirmative action that we'll accept is this diversity rationale, where they say, we'll let you have affirmative action so long as you say to us that you'll have better class discussion, a more interesting, campus life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when administrators are told that by the courts, guess what the administrators say? We'll have better class discussion. We'll have a better campus life. There'll be, more vigorous discussion at the, dining room table. Now, of course, what you say, Tyrone Washington, black Tyrone Washington from Detroit, and white Sally Washington from Iowa, for both of them, 2 and 2 equals 4. And whatever difference in socialization, whatever perspective, 2 and 2 equals is 4. And I think, frankly, that the diversity rationale, I used to scoff at it, to tell you the truth. I don't scoff at it anymore. I think that there is something to it, actually. But it's impressionistic. Whatever there is to it, I think, is rather soft. I don't think it is the strongest rationale at all. And I think it has unfortunately led people to making arguments that, are completely vulnerable to the argument that you just articulated. And, I'm not going to try to defend, a policy against your argument, because it seems to me that your argument is correct. But I think that there are other better arguments to voice. But the courts have made it so that it's impolitic to voice those arguments.
But the diversity is only defined as hyphenated Americans. I'm just saying it's kind of ridiculous when physics is full of people from all over the world, right? And it's actually far more culturally diverse as a result. And yet, oh no, we're not meeting our statistics by not promoting one group of hyphenated Americans who, it's just like, even if you just took them as a fraction of Americans, because the American fraction is well below 50%, you get to this small number thing. And so we just sit back and it's like, this is mesmerizing that we're all on the verge of, getting attacked. for things that are statistically absurd.
Well, I mean, some people have said, frankly, if diversity is the name of the game, then why don't we have, many more international students? If diversity.
Which we do in the sciences, that's all I'm saying.
Right, but just as a general matter,
Yeah.
if you're going to say that diversity is your thing, then the idea would be, well, geez, if diversity is your thing, let's go around the world. Why is it that why are we so focused on Americans if diversity is your thing? But of course, it's like many things. It was a theory that was made up in order to, it was viewed as palatable. It was a sort of a way of justifying affirmative action with a theory that was thought to get around certain problems. Now, the irony is, one of the problems that it was thought to get around was the question of time. This is a theory that, Justice Lewis Powell was the most important person in this. And one of the reasons he liked it was because he said, well, geez, I'm concerned about an endpoint. But I think one of the great ironies is, as I indicated in my paper, the diversity rationale is a rationale without an endpoint. Others.
2 + 2 = 4 is how we understand physics.
Common formula.
Martha.
Well, Randy, I listened to your talk from beginning to end, but it seemed like when you got to the end, you'd answered your own question. Because you start by asking, what is the promised land? And then by the end, I think you made a nice, well, it appealed to me, a nice defense of what you called a kind of hodgepodge. A sort of pragmatic working out of particulars in particular situations on whatever, a more localized and decentralized and less top-down definition of what it takes for a multiracial society to get along, never mind a black-white dynamic that isn't totally destructive to people. So is that the promised land? And then we've devolved back to grand policies like affirmative action and, the quirks of, obviously affirmative action in your situation is kind of a nutty idea, but that feeds your point that, all racial promised lands are local, I suppose you could say. And one thing that came to my mind in that setting was higher education and the kind of stuff that's going on now with undergraduates and the total collapse of administrators, the sort of seeming lack of a backbone among many university administrators when confronted with the anger of minority students, in particular African American students, but others as well. This complete inability to kind of deal with the immediate situation. I was at the University of Oklahoma after they had the incident with the frat boys on the bus, And on the ground at the University of Oklahoma, there was a lot going on, and a lot of conversations going on. At the level of the national media, it was insanity, And what I'm trying to say is, what would it take to develop a capacity among decision makers at universities, just stick with that example, to be able to deal with these situations in a more fine-grained way, in a way that, sort of deals with the reality of what the students are actually upset about, instead of just collapsing and accepting all of their demands, some of which are probably illogical and don't make a lot of sense. How do you develop that capacity to have a hodgepodge, to have a situation in which, people can sort of locally make wiser as opposed to more foolish decisions about these things and not feel dictated to?
Well, first, you're right about the trajectory of the paper, and that happens. And, you start writing a paper, and you think one thing on Monday. You're starting, and then Thursday comes around, and you're at page 10. And over the course of the writing, you've learned things, and your mind changes.
I wasn't meant as a criticism.
No, I'm just telling you. I didn't take it as such, I think in fact that actually things have changed. And in fact, what you heard was the evolution of the paper. So when I began it, I really did think, gosh, I'm saying to myself, you and lots of other people, how is it there's been all of this reading and all of this writing and all of this discussion, and Kennedy, what do you want? And I can't really, I can hum a few bars, but I can't really hum a whole lot more than a few bars. Well, gosh, isn't that a problem? And that's where I began, and that was it was an accusation. It was this is a real deficiency. This is a real problem. And then as I was proceeding and sort of work, near the end, well, maybe it's not. I mean, maybe it's not such a bad thing after all to be in a position that says, to tell you the truth, I can't tell you all of what I want. I mean, out there, I'm here. My eyesight is limited. My eyesight is limited by where I am. My eyesight is limited by my socialization. My eyesight is limited by lots of things. I know what is bad. I mean, I think of this book, The Decent Society, in which, I forget the guy who wrote it, but basically he says, let's not be maximalists. Maybe it's too much to ask. We want a sort of a full-fledged egalitarian society. No, we just want a society that's, let's have a more modest requirement. We don't want indecency. We don't want humiliation. We don't want this. We don't want that. In our own context, that's right. We've seen slavery. We don't like that. We don't want segregation. Maybe we see things that we don't want. We work on those things that we don't want. And maybe that is the way to go. I mean, it could be that what was initially very dissatisfying might be actually okay. And so, I mean, that evolution is sort of where I am. Mm-hmm. On your second question, what do administrators do? I feel for administrators. I think that, people who are in, high administration in these, colleges and universities, I think it's a really tough job. You've got all these different constituencies. My sense is that a lot of them are, trying to, do right.
That's the sticking point.
I do.
Exactly the sticking point. What is right? How do they? What kind of discrimination in another sense of the word? Can they exercise? Do they exercise?
Yeah, I don't have a, I do not have a good how to do it pamphlet. I think it's a tough job. I agree with you. I mean, I do think that, there are, I think that some people, for instance, and I feel for them because I think they have really decent intuitions. They're generous people. And so, and they really feel for people who they know that either the people in front of them or, the people behind the people in front of them have been mistreated. And so their instinct, their deep instinct is a generous one. And sometimes that very generousness of feeling prevents them from saying things that really need to be said. And, I think there's probably going to be a season in which that's going to happen. And, hopefully people are going to see that, sometimes it really does not help people. It does not help people. In fact, it misleads people to sort of humor them, pander, say things which are untrue. It would actually be better to say, listen, I really respect you, and I'm going to show my respect for you by leveling with you and telling you what I really think. Now, I'm going to tell you what I really think. You can tell me what you really think, and let's be adults about this, and really have some real straight talk. How one accomplishes that, it's very difficult.
That's my question.
Yeah, I don't have a A to Z on that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Peter Scarry.
Yes. Randy, I really enjoyed your presentation, but I want to push you a little bit on and take you up on your offer to look at the promised land, at least my version of it, okay? The promised land, it's an African-American metaphor. The more you talk, what has been on my mind for a long time, just rushes at me, which is that I don't quite understand why one doesn't want to address that the promised land is a metaphor, is a goal, is a path forward that is fairly unique to the African American experience in America. Now, it doesn't mean it can't get appropriated. I understand, but what I'd like you to address a bit is not just the Supreme Court's role in this this phenomenon that we're addressing, but the broader political agenda, which I think is just as important, which is that we're talking about this congeries of different groups, a rainbow or a multicultural phenomenon, when it seems to me that what we really ought to be talking about, if we're talking about the promised land, is the relatively unique experience of African Americans in America, and the unique tragedy of that experience and what was visited upon them and what America owes African Americans. And that, of course, that's not quite acceptable discourse, because now we have any number of other groups who make similar kinds of claims. And in your own remarks, but we all do it, there's a litany of groups here that are now benefit from this kind of political agenda, which I think is a political agenda more than it was a legal agenda, whereby other groups have learned to make similar kinds of claims, so that we're in a place where I think the American people, to pick the obvious group that is playing this role in American life today, have heard enough Hispanic leaders make enough claims and make enough charges that they've come to believe that whatever problem blacks are, whatever problems blacks pose, whether out of some nasty sense that blacks got too much or some more noble sense that blacks have been mistreated in our history and therefore deserve something quite extraordinary given our history, that Hispanics are in the same place. So you flip that around, and I think this is what we're in the middle of, in part, seeing in our political process now. Well, we don't want any more of those people. We don't want any more problems like that. Thank you very much. Go away. So it seems to me that there's a political agenda here. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, reflects the fact that for all this Sturm und Drang over diversity, or because of it, I think the unique claims that blacks have on the rest of America have gotten obliterated. The Black Lives Matter movement, to my mind, reflects the past 15 years where what's dominated the domestic political agenda? Immigration, i.e. Hispanics, And terrorism, i.e. Muslims. Where were blacks in the last 15 years? Well, many of them were experiencing the kinds of poverty that Paul pointed to, and their agenda was completely lost. So I just would like you to address why have black leaders, why have black intellectuals, in my opinion, and I don't mean this personally to you, have so cravenly abandoned their unique claims?
Well, I don't. Couple things. First, on the, you began by, an African American metaphor. I mean,
Well,
Promised Land. I mean, there are a whole bunch of groups. I mean, one of the things I like about it, I mean, Promised Land. Look, it seems to me a lot of folks can identify with the idea of, longing for, sort of an ideal.
sure.
It's a, it's a term that I think resonates with lots of different groups, and that's so the, what is the ideal to which we are seeking? Where are we trying to get to? But on the uniqueness point, I think that there'd be a goodly number of black intellectuals and activists who would wholeheartedly embrace what you say and champion the idea of, champion the exceptionalism of the black American experience. I think it's a complicated thing, though. I mean, I must say, I've done it both ways. This is the case with so many things. I've gone this way on, I go this way on Monday and I go this way on Wednesday. I think that there is something unique, but I mean, there's something unique about, there's something unique about every group. One problem I see with the exceptionalism route is that I think it can fall victim to a sort of parochialism. I mean, I think, obviously it's the case that black Americans have a unique history. Obviously, slavery and the aftermath of slavery, and de Tocqueville was right when he talked about the three races of America and how everyone will always remember that it was the black people who were the slaves, and that itself was a very distinctive thing. On the other hand, I think that everybody can become complacent, and black people too. It's not as if black people are the only people who've faced oppression. And I think actually that more and more as we proceed, I think that we live in a multiracial society. It's not just whites and blacks. It's all sorts of people from all different places who have a right to, their shot at the American dream and have to be accommodated. So, this year, you go back to higher education. In this year, one of the central things about higher education, one of the central issues, has been the issue of dememorialization. So, dememorialization at my alma mater, Princeton, Woodrow Wilson. Dememorialization at my alma mater for law school, Yale, John C. Calhoun. Dememorialization at my workplace, Harvard Law School, the Royal Crest. All these places, dememorialization. All three main focus Black Americans. I think, I'm fine. It was a good discussion. I think it is interesting, though, that, well, what about the memorialization issues involving, Native Americans? Nobody says boo about Native Americans. We've got a whole country taken from Native Americans. And every once in a while, somebody says something about some Native Americans, but believe me, it's vanishing. It's every once in a while. Well, why is that? That's because Native Americans, there's a reason for that. It's because Native Americans actually are such a weak political force that their voices, aren't heard. And you could say that for other groups too. And I think actually that the Black American experience is a really complicated experience. It is an experience of, Black Americans do occupy a very exceptional place in American life, in which it is true that there is a very, substantial portion of Black America that is in very bad shape. There is another portion of Black America that actually has a story that is remarkable in the modern world. A person who calls himself and is accepted as Black American has the nuclear button at his fingertips and is in the White House. Black Americans in various, portions of American life actually are, quite present and powerful. How do we know that they are present and powerful? Look at the discussion. So, I think actually that going forward, we really do have to ask the question, well, however we divvy up things, whatever our model is, well, what does it mean for Asian Americans? Not that many of them. Well, what does it mean for them? There was a time, frankly, where I used to poo-poo this. Bad on me. I don't think we can. What does this mean for other folks?
Unfortunately, it's really hard to have that discussion because all those other groups come under the same moral umbrella and claim the same moral burden that has been visited upon African Americans.
Well, then we need to correct that. So, for instance, there are periods when, again, the affirmative action debate comes up. So sometime, everybody in here knows that, Asian Americans, there are various Asian American groups that have, challenged affirmative action. And, and in my discussions, I talk with, Asian American students. Asian American students will say to me, for instance, I'm against this affirmative action thing. Kennedy, I don't have anything against your people. But, my people didn't, enslave your people. And my people just came over relatively recently. We didn't have nothing to do with it. Kennedy, what have you got to say to me? And I say, I've got plenty to say to you. Here's what I've got to, among other things, listen. In 1941, my people didn't have anything to do with the United States government interning people of Japanese ancestry. My folks, that wasn't, we weren't in that. But in 1988, when it came to a vote on whether the United States government should apologize to people of Japanese ancestry and pay reparations, all for it. All for it. Because I'm part of the society, the society did wrong to people of Japanese ancestry. I'm glad that the United States government has apologized. I think the United States government should pay reparations because I'm part of this society. I want to embrace the good, and I also want to embrace the bad. I think, as far as, whenever you came over, the race question and the black-white part of it is part of your inheritance. That's part of what I would say. And, every group is a bit different. We need to educate ourselves about the differences and try to work things out close to the ground. It's not going to be a big blueprint. It's going to be interstitial. It's going to be experimental. It's going to be hit or miss.
A hodgepodge.
A hodgepodge. In any event, that's the best I can do as a response.
Harvey Silverglade.
I used to be a great believer in affirmative action until I had a brain-shaking experience. My son was in the King Open School in Cambridge, and those kids, there were a group of 5 friends who studied every night over at my house because it was quiet. There were 2 white kids, including my son, 2 black kids, and 1 Hispanic kid, totally self-selected. They called themselves the Posse, and they're still friendly today. They were studying for a math test, and I was in the next room. I was listening. I was eavesdropping, actually. And one of the black kids says, I don't have to study this. I'm going to get in college for affirmative action. I'm going to go home. And I walked into the room and I grabbed him by the collar and I pulled him out and I gave him a lecture that it didn't matter. He's got to understand the math, and I don't give a damn whether he's getting into college or not. College isn't the point. The math is the point. And he got back to studying, and they all went to college. All 5 kids got into college. They were all doing really well. But that got me thinking, like nothing else got me thinking about affirmative action. And one other thing happened. Again, King Open School. I got more of an education at the King School than my son did. A white math teacher with a terrific reputation was in Shady Hill. She was teaching in Shady Hill. And she decided she wanted to teach in the public school. She wanted to get into the King Open, which was one of the experimental programs. And she applied for the job. She was vetoed by 2 groups. One were the folks who believed that that more black teachers had to get into the school. The fact that you had a master math teacher willing to come in didn't matter. And she was also moved against by the teachers union because she didn't have seniority. There were a number of incompetents who were in line before she could get the job. I went nuts, and that colored my view about teachers unions. So I became a member of the great right-wing conspiracy at that point. And of course, it all came from experience. And I'd like your comment on my life experience. There are many more, by the way, but these were the 2 experiences that got me thinking about traditional liberal approach to these problems.
Okay.
And by the way, I still consider myself to be a liberal, traditional liberal, not a progressive.
Okay. I said before I am, and I remain a staunch defender of affirmative action. Does that mean, is there stupid affirmative action plans? I mean, this is a big country. Any social policy can be administered in a dumb way. I mean, think of it, we have tax policies. Some are sensible, some are dumb. Of course you're going to have people who do dumb things. Of course there are going to be costs. There are people who there are some defenders of affirmative action whose response to me is with friends like me who needs enemies. Because one of the things I say, and I make no bones about it, does affirmative action have costs? Are some of the costs virtually inescapable? I think some of the costs are virtually inescapable. I think, for instance, that the stigma costs. Is there a stigma cost? Yes, there's a stigma cost. Yes, there's a stigma cost. I see the stigma cost. I teach contracts. I teach courses on race relations law, but the course I teach, every year, contracts. I have no doubt that on the very first day of class, when the students come in, that very first day, they're nervous, they're just meeting one another, they're just nervous. They come in, and then I go to the front of the class. I have no doubt